Welcome to the Future Diplomats Society.
Good evening, Future Diplomats. For those who are not on the call and that may watch this later, welcome. And for those that are here in the study session, definitely thank you and welcome tonight. We just had a really great conversation the last hour and 15 minutes, just speaking about some of our experiences with the Foreign Service Officer test, and no one broke their NDA. I just want to make sure I say that. We're picking up from last time we met with Matthew, and where we were discussing the U.S. policy towards China. And the 22nd is when we were speaking. And just to make sure I am touching on the announcements, the testing window is now. So if you're taking the FSOT, our thoughts and prayers are with you. People are in the chat saying good luck to you. So we look forward to hearing about your results in the next 6 to 8 weeks. And I think it didn't take that long for the results to start coming out. We did not finish our session last week because it was just so good and the engagement was high and there were a lot of conversation about it.
And so maybe I can just remind you all that the single phrase that comes up the most in regards to the US and China for the second half of the 19th century is this open door policy. And that really continues, though, right through to the Second World War, because the US is primarily concerned with trade. And the US, of course, has a different relationship with Japan. Here we're looking at the modern Chinese flags. The flag of China at the time of the open door policy was something different. You're going to have a famous book written in the 30s when the communists start to become powerful that's called Red Star over China. And so you see in this flag here by Edgar Snow, who's an American journalist, who's one of the very few who's actually allowed to go to the Communist Party headquarters, meet with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and gain firsthand information about that. But obviously, under the empire, under the Qing Empire, it was more of a stylized. I believe there was a dragon and some such. There, different motifs. Let's say. So just say that so that we are not anachronistic. But I mentioned here William McKinley when he's president and Secretary of State John Hay. I mean, Hay's counterpart for the Chinese was a Minister Wu, and so he used to be asked by journalists what exactly they were hashing out in these endless trade negotiations. And so Hay famously said, well, he talked until I was woozy, and then I talked until he was hazy. But the main point is that he's consistently pushing for, American trade rights, arguably privileges, and the most favorable, the idea of most favored nation status that was discussed a lot in international economic diplomacy in the 80s and 90s. Goes back further. It goes back to the period of Hay, where everyone, the Western countries, competed to be the most favored nation by the Chinese government. But on the other hand, the Chinese kind of had an interest in playing them off against each other and not blatantly playing favorites among them. You see here that I mentioned Hay actually sends his open door notes. I mean, this is a kind of a breakthrough in diplomacy of a kind for 1899-1900, where he's sending notes to diplomatic representatives from many other countries who also have economic interests in China. So he's doing this as a goodwill gesture to show that while my ultimate loyalties are to the United States, I want this to work for everybody. And at the same time, he's aware, and I think it wasn't particularly a secret at the time, that as with several other empires in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, China was not militarily or socially particularly strong or coherent. Population can make up for a lot, but the Qing don't seem to have, they were perceived as very corrupt, and it's hard not to think of the Ottoman Empire as a parallel, and not to have really even an inclination to bring the peasant masses up economically. So it was perceived that there were potential powder kegs. And of course, people hadn't forgotten about the Taiping Rebellion that we mentioned last time, an incredibly bloody conflict, and the Boxer Rebellion, which was less bloody, but still showed that there was very strong anti-foreigner sentiment, and that the position of countries like the United States and China was arguably very tenuous, depending in the case of the Boxers, literally on Marines guarding the American trading posts and having to fight them off. And so, yes, arguably, diplomacy was very delicate indeed. If we turn to the next slide, I wanted to talk about this man. I've encountered at least 3 versions of his name in America, and in English-speaking countries, he's most often called Sun Yat-sen. He's also called Sun Wen in China itself, and sometimes Sun Meng. And I mentioned this Yuan Shikai, although I don't have a picture for your delectation. Yuan was a general in the late Qing dynasty, and these two are big rivals around the time when it becomes clear that there's so much resentment of the Qing dynasty that it's going to fall altogether. And so in 1911, 1912, revolutionaries, including these two and many other people who have conflicting agendas of their own, it's not some unified revolutionary front, but then again, few revolutions are, but they negotiate with the Qing that the emperor is going to abdicate. Fu Yi, very young boy, who spent most of his early life, just at a court dominated by the Dowager Empress Cixi, who was very powerful in the last decades of Qing rule. Once she dies, he's really, alone and a little bit out of his depth, and he's given Western tutors and so on. This particular case, I don't recommend for all purposes, but there is, the movie The Last Emperor by Bernardo Bertolucci is remarkable in how much detail it has about these things. And the last emperor in question is that boy emperor Pu Yi. So they sign a deal whereby he's going to abdicate. They're allowed to retain their residence in the Forbidden City in Beijing. In other words, the royal residences for another, ends up being about a decade before they're actually forced to leave. And gradually the state cuts off financial support for the garrisons that had been kind of the mainstays, the main military supports of the Qing for most of the Qing dynasty, although that had started to break down as a system in the late 19th century. Here too, you have a parallel with the Ottoman Empire, which had gotten rid of its most feared warriors, the Janissaries, in the 19th century, and replaced them with something they call the New Model Army. Similarly, there are different new armies that form in the late 19th century in China to replace the old Manchu garrisons that used to be the backbone of the army. And Yuan Shikai, whom I mentioned here, is a general, rises through the ranks to become a general in those armies, the last of which he also founds, called the Beiyang Army. But these two at times act, Yuan I'm talking about, and Sun, act more as rivals, and at time more in collaboration, because they do agree about a general idea that China should be free, that Chinese, what we can call nationalism, is a positive force, so long as, and they do value unity. They see that disunity can, just like Benjamin Franklin said, if we don't all hang together, we'll hang separately. So Sun is responsible mainly, although he has other people crafting these ideas with him, for this slogan, 5 races under one union, that comes about and becomes one of the mainstays of this new Republic of China that is formed in 1912. And the 5 races in question, it's kind of interesting, right? Because some of you know, this would be an excellent quiz question. Just thought of it. Actually, I guess I thought of it this afternoon, but let me try this right now. In modern Chinese parlance today, the Chinese Communist official line, how many different ethnic groups are official nationalities of China? Let's say the following: A, 89, B, 12, C, 54, or D, 5. How about that? I can't remember what I just said, but I think I know which one is the correct answer. It is no longer in modern parlance 5, I'm sorry to say. So it's not D. So there, we eliminated D. No, the actual number, wait, did I even say the correct number as one of my choices? That would be alarming. Maybe I didn't. The correct answer is 54. Did I give that as one of the possibilities? Maybe I didn't. Sorry, 54 is the correct answer. And so it's a lot more than 5 is the point, though. And there are posters you can see from the 1950s. The Chinese government sent out anthropologists kind of to actually make ethnic distinctions and decide who would qualify as one of these so-called minsu, or national minorities, who, you know, they even have an official national university of minorities in China and various other things. And politically, they are given quotas for a certain number of university slots. So there are culturally things at stake. You could say a kind of equivalent to affirmative action. There are real political issues at stake in determining who counts as an officially approved minority. But it was much more simple in these early days of the Republic. You had these 5. The Mongols had previously ruled China. I can't help but think that's one reason why they're included. I mean, they weren't an especially numerous ethnic group within China, but they had founded the Yuan dynasty under Genghis Khan in the 13th century, and that's probably one reason why. Tibetans, similarly, I mean, the first time I saw this, I was very surprised, because those of you who imagine where China is, Tibet's obviously very far to the west. It's not super close to the Eastern Chinese peoples that tended to dominate the Chinese Empire for most of its history. But I can't help but think that there's a historical explanation, which is that the lamas, the Buddhist lamas of Tibet, I'm not talking about Peruvian Lama, the creature, I'm talking about Lama, the holy men of Tibetan Buddhism, had been incredibly influential upon many emperors from at least the 16th century onwards. And they and really earlier, I think. So they had accordingly a relationship that I think this slogan was trying to respect. They had a long history of relationship with the central government. At this point, this is long before tanks are going to roll into Lhasa in 1950 and so on. So it's not so much about asserting control, I don't think, over Tibet, but it is asserting a historic connection, even though Tibet's very far in the west. And then Manchus, well, this is kind of a goodwill gesture. It's because the more radical revolutionaries actually wanted to annihilate the Manchus. They said they had, their feeling was that they'd been treated so oppressively by the Manchu, who were the backbone of the Qing dynasty that had just been deposed, that the Manchus had to either be expelled, killed, or just, had no future in Chinese society. To make them, therefore, one of these so-called 5 races or 5 peoples under one union was a generous thing. And then the Hui, the Chinese Muslims, these are the people who are nowadays called Uyghurs and are obviously a major issue as far as how well or poorly the Chinese government treats them. And then you have this replacement of Nanjing replacing Beijing as the capital. These capitals, though, they circulate. This is not as earth-shattering as it might seem. Beijing actually only went back to 1430, which, by the standards of the antiquity of Chinese civilization, I know it sounds to an American audience like a long time, but what the capital was had actually varied quite a bit. Can we try the next? So yeah, these are some of the points I mentioned. I just think this is actually an image of Sun that is currently in Penang in Malaysia. It's pretty interesting just to see how nationalism worked in different parts of the world. So this is really what I want to say, and this is a connection that certainly is still relevant in 2025, is what exactly is Chinese nationalism? What does it amount to? Is it sometimes oversold? Is it comparable to what some people would call the most pernicious manifestations of nationalism in the past, like German nationalism? But what I do think is interesting about Sun compared to Yuan Shikai or other kind of reformers within China in the late 19th, early 20th centuries is he really draws very heavily upon the support of overseas Chinese. He is pushing for reforms in China proper, but yet goes to small Chinese communities in London at one point, but also mostly these very old, centuries old Chinese overseas trading communities that existed in Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, as I mentioned, and Singapore also. He has this new Tongmen Hui party. And so overseas Chinese are really clearly feeling invested. It is, from the amount that they donated, it's quite clear from the also number of people who are active supporters of Sun and willing to make sacrifices on behalf of his movement. So it's just an interesting aspect of Chinese nationalism that I think shouldn't pass without comment. Is, why did they feel such a kinship, even if they're living hundreds of miles away in Southeast Asia, with events in China? This ethnic solidarity is quite significant. Let's look at the next. I feel I have to not exactly rush a little bit, but yeah, sure. Why don't we try this one? Oh, okay. Well, there's the answer there at the bottom. So therefore, the exception is, in this case, I'll help you all out. It's D, the Hakka. Does anyone remember, though? I could ask as a not multiple choice quiz, who's the significant figure from last time that we encountered who was a Hakka, and whom I think it's relevant to know that about him, to understand his importance for Chinese history? I know the names are difficult to pronounce, but that's no excuse. I'm talking about Hong. I believe his last name is Shichung. Hong, who was the main general and commander who founded the Heavenly Armies of the Taiping Rebellion. He was a Hakka. The Hakka were a poor southern community who were on the outs with the Cantonese. Yeah. Let's look at the next, shall we? And eventually we'll even get into the middle of the 20th century. So I do think it's useful to know the date of the foundation of the Communist Party of China, recognizing basically that if you're talking about the modern history of countries, there is a little bit of offset of time, right? Not everyone is on identical schedules, of course, of whatever you regard development as. And so communist parties were set up quite a bit earlier in Europe, but of course, Marxist ideas took some time to travel as far as Shanghai. This is a period when a lot of American radicals, like this journalist I mentioned last time, Agnes Smedley, and like a number of other people, large number of other people, end up in Shanghai and sometimes in other Chinese cities as well, and are observing. There's a student movement that I don't explicitly mention on this slide that forms, called the May 4th movement, that is mainly formed to object to a provision that comes out of the end of the World War I that decrees that the eastern peninsula, known as the Shandong Peninsula of China, is going to pass to Japan, and that is strenuously objected to by these student radicals. So you see once again that there's a kind of mix in their case of leftist ideas about equality with a strong nationalism. We also want, though, territorial integrity and no foreign power, including Japan, to rule over that. I mean, you go back far enough in history, China and Japan have a shared history, and Japan was, I would say, more often than not on the receiving end. In other words, they adopted the Chinese alphabet, among many other things. Buddhism was kind of transmitted to Japan largely through China and so forth. But by the end of the 19th century, they are clearly viewing themselves as distinct nations with distinct paths, and the Chinese certainly, take umbrage at the idea of Japan ruling over even a relatively small peninsula. So I mentioned that conflict breaks out between the forces of the Republic of China that by the late 1920s are commanded by Chiang Kai-shek, because Sun Yat-sen, who at times can be described as a friend to Chiang, but he had died in 1925. The political alliances keep shifting, though. This is a period that is often known as a warlord period in China, and people will write books about the warlord era because the alliances are continually shifting. And there is a family of sisters. Last time you might remember, I showed you Truman together with Sung Mei-ling, who's the wife of Chiang Kai-shek. But all of the Sung sisters married very high political figures. Another of the Sung sisters married Sun Yat-sen, for example. So Chiang and Sun ended up as brothers-in-law, married to two sisters. And the third also married a high-up political person, as I recall. Sun Yat-sen, I mean, I do want to stress this, what I mentioned here about the fact that people, both among the so-called nationalists, the Kuomintang, who follow Chiang Kai-shek, and among the Communist Party that is now forming at this time, both of them saw things to admire in Sun Yat-sen. Both liked things about his brand of nationalism and unity and concern for enlightening and, to some extent, raising up the masses. Just they want to go about it in different ways. But to this day, a sign of that is that both in Taiwan and in mainland China, he is revered. And mainland China still has in Canton, now called Guangzhou, a university named Sun Yat-sen University. So one of the very few figures, I mean, comparable, to go back again to the Ottoman Empire, since I study it a lot, I think, to Ataturk, who manages to be revered by a lot of different points across the Turkish political spectrum, no matter what their rabid disagreements with each other. But there are certain people who kind of transcend these differences, arguably George Washington in this country, and Sun Yat-sen is one of them. In fact, he has been compared to a Chinese George Washington repeatedly. Sure, I say the ideas of the KMT were less coherent than those of the CCP. There is one bit of background I don't think I explicitly put on this slide, but the KMT do benefit, now to go back to the American perception of them, as more hospitable to Christianity. Already in the US, when the first kind of anti-socialist and then later anti-communist political works begin to be written, the sort of irreligious, godless character of communism begins to be referred to. And so, by contrast, the Kuomintang, we already established that Madam Chiang was a Christian who attended a missionary school for high school, then attended an American university in, as I recall, the Deep South in, at one point in Alabama. And then she settled for a time actually here in North Carolina. But so Chiang himself is a kind of nominal, my reading suggests, not deeply committed convert to Methodism, but just the fact of being a nominal Christian still sets him apart in American perception. So Chiang, in other words, as the chair of the KMT, the Kuomintang, like many other Southeast Asian leaders, we'll see, when, for example, you get to the Korean War in the 50s, the fact that the South Korean leader Syngman Rhee was a Protestant Christian was going to tend to attract more Western, including American, sympathies for him than the godless North Koreans would. Similarly, in Vietnam, a lot of the Catholics, like Diem, even though he was a corrupt prime minister, but because they were influenced by Christianity, would often tend to be those whom Western powers gravitated towards and threw their support behind. There is that aspect of things. I mean, interestingly enough, though, it's really a love-hate relationship. So until we get to really the late 40s, there was at least some possibility the KMT and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, in other words, could have coexisted. There were specific discussions about how you could belong to both parties. Now, we need to make it permissible to be a member of both political parties, which have no real exact equivalent that I can see in American history. There's no point where, a sign of brotherhood was that you can register as both a Democrat and a Republican, and that's considered a unifying part of things. I think maybe the very way we should be cautious about assuming that the very way political factions or parties were thought about at this time and in this context in China were the same as we have in the past in the United States and do today. A very famous phrase that I don't specifically mention here, but that belongs on with this slide is, oh, yes, I do. Sorry. The Long March of 1934-35. Sometimes I don't give myself enough credit. This is when Mao marches his armies and the other communist commanders from the south up in a grueling march where, a gigantic percentage of their troops die off of starvation and disease. But they established a new capital and headquarters in the north, in Yan'an, whereas before that they had been well to the south of this. And Yan'an is remote. They felt that they could consolidate their power there. In the long term, the KMT doesn't seem to have developed a real plan. This is probably what led me to write Less Coherent, for dealing with and keeping the loyalty of the Chinese peasantry, which was the vast majority of the country. So they are continuing to starve, and the KMT is not perceived as doing enough for them. And there are some social science phrases that you pick up at American universities, like revolutions of rising expectations, and might explain why the peasants come to see the communists increasingly as their hope, because Mao really does, whatever his actions may have resulted in, but he did seem at the time, especially in these early days before the Second World War, committed to improving the peasants' lot. So many of them actually even defect. They might initially join the KMT armies and then defect to the CCP armies. But at least for the moment, it seems very unlikely. The CCP is quite isolated. It seems very unlikely that they'll actually be able to take over the country. And this changes somewhat. Can we check the next, please, Travis? So when you get to the invasions, first of Manchuria in 1931 by the Japanese, and then eventually on a broader scale, the so-called Rape of Nanjing or Nanking in 1937, and a full-scale invasion of eastern China by the Japanese, that is a time when the KMT and the CCP, for the most part, agree to put aside their differences. And again, it's a bewildering panorama of shifting loyalties, where some generals end up fighting against both the communists and the Japanese, others ally with the communists against the Japanese, and so forth. But there is certainly a banding together, much as Russian political differences were to a great extent put aside during the so-called Great Patriotic War once the Germans invaded in 1941. There's a lot of putting aside of differences. You can see a huge sum of aid was given by the US in this period, and it was partially in just outright aid, $4 billion in the currency of these times during the administrations of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, meaning from 1933 through 1953, those 20 years, a crucial 20 years. And there are more, hundreds of millions of dollars more in credits during the Second World War. So when the US sets up the famous Lend-Lease Act, it's going to allow China to buy at tremendous discounts specific types of materiel that are handy for it to fight against Japan, like trucks and other and armaments, munitions, a lot of weapons of war. There may be details as to which specific weapons the U.S. had to restrict itself from selling before Pearl Harbor, lest it be considered in violation of international treaties and therefore in a state of war with Japan. I'd have to look more into those details, but it certainly did a lot for China at this time. And I say to Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT because they were in control of the Republic of China's government, but the U.S. did understand pragmatically why also it was in their interest to not suggest some massive campaign of stamping out the Communist Party at this time. We're not quite at the Cold War yet during the Second World War, so they understood this necessity of some kind of common front against Japan. And so it's under those circumstances that you had that book that I alluded to earlier, the so-called Red Star Over China by Edgar Snow, where because the U.S. Is not strongly anti-Mao at this point, doesn't really know much about him, Snow is allowed to report back, and I'm talking about the book itself is published in 1937 based on Snow's travels in 1935 and 1936. So at this point, Mao is more of an unknown quantity, and also Americans are hesitant to assume that the way communism is going to manifest itself in China, which had a very different history from Russia, is going to be the same. Yeah, post-war aid, this is a little bit repetitive. So be it. I'll make these slides better for next time, but I'm gradually improving them. Can we go to the next one? Yeah, I think that's a fair statement that the Japanese didn't see any faction really in mainland China as their ally. In Korea, as in China, you had a certain number, I would judge a fairly small number, of outright collaborators. I mean, in Korea, you actually have some people who are born with Korean names, but are so enamored of the Japanese imperial project that they will adopt Japanese names, kind of try to Japanize their identity and so on. I think that phenomenon of collaboration was actually more common in Korea than in China, where the battle lines arguably were more clearly drawn. But Japan's kind of center of operations remains this northern region called Manchuria, which they try to make into a new republic called Manchukuo, and briefly into a puppet empire, where they bring back that last emperor we mentioned before, Puyi. And by the way, if you really want to get, what's the word? I suppose niggling about details, you could say that Puyi was not the last emperor because that general Yuan Shikai, whom I mentioned to you, who's going to die relatively early on in the Republic period. He dies in 1916, but there's a short period in 1913-14, after the fall of the Qing, in other words, when Yuan Shikai proclaims himself as emperor of China. And eventually then kind of changes his mind and becomes president of the new Republic of China. But he is really the last emperor. And Yuan was a very established soldier by that time in his 50s. Let's go and see the next slide, since I think I have dealt with that. This I thought was interesting. I think I found this in one of these slides that has sample questions about job knowledge. But who is the US's current principal trading partner? Wow. That was fast. Those of you who are putting the answers, I see B, I see D, but the considerable majority are saying D. And you see, my inclination was to answer that it was China, but it's actually Mexico still to this day. I know it says that, but I don't know. I'm getting conflicting information. I tend to think it probably is Mexico. I wonder how old this is. It might have gone back and forth, but because of the tariff situation, the outright trade war now, I think it might not be China anymore. But
yeah, so this says 334 billion for U.S. exports, and it's from Mexico, and then 144 billion for China, 370 billion. So I think it does vary depending on what it is. Mark says there are different ways to measure trade, depending.
Yeah,
that's true. So, but Matthew did not give me this chart. I found it based on the response. So I'll probably remove it for the slides, and I will make sure to share the slides. So, what is the answer that you are stating?
Well, Mexico is what I was looking for, and
okay.
I guess the point is that although China's substantial, but it's not actually the top. It's almost in a way though beside the point, because the U.S. has to constantly monitor what resources and so on China is exploiting, what she's exporting. So just based on having to follow China, it's almost as if she might as well be our predominant trading partner, given the amount of attention that the foreign policy establishment has to pay to China's trade activities at all times. Yeah. So what comes after this? Maybe we should. Okay. So Roosevelt, Truman, and the fear of China. Yeah. I mean, from Nathan, we learned about some of Truman's domestic policies. As background, I'm mentioning a bit very briefly about American perceptions of the very, the sort of visceral fear that communism was inspiring by the early 20th century, because it was seen as an even more radical version of socialism. And you had a number of incidents of unrest especially in the Midwest. You find that really Chicago, but other Midwestern centers as well, were centers of radical organizing beginning of the late 19th century, maybe because they had very large populations, both of laborers in factories and of recent immigrants who arguably were sort of fertile ground for socialist ideas. But, if socialism is perceived as threatening, then communism is especially so, is seen as a much more radical, leveling version of that. And so things certainly don't get any better when news comes filtered out about the Russian Revolution and the killing of the imperial family by Bolsheviks who are perceived to be dangerous fanatics. So the can you go to the next slide, please? I think there's more about things like the. Oh, okay. There are going to be the Palmer raids right after the First World War, and this is all I wanted to say. And right through the 1920s and 30s, an increasing fear of communism, still not generally, as far as I know, referred to as the Cold War before 1945, but there are incidents where leftists, whether anarchists or communists, are virtually lynched. They're strongly frowned upon. There are means taken to make it difficult to employ them, and so on. So it was perceived as a big deal. But it seems, my strong impression is that right up until the end of certainly the Second World War, it was not seen as likely that the communists would actually be able to take over. And in fact, it seems like a relatively short period in 1948, 1949, where the corruption of the KMT really becomes back to haunt them, and it becomes clear that the CCP is actually going to be able to drive them out entirely. You've got another wave of defections, but also the peasants are joining the CCP in enormous numbers, meaning that they actually they I don't think ever attain military parity with the KMT, but they have all the sort of fervor on their side, and so they're able to literally drive them into the sea. And some people take refuge on different islands like Hainan Island, but most actually go to Taiwan, where they set up. And when you hear that, realize that Taiwan already had a native people of its own. So there's a whole issue on Taiwan today, in fact, of conflict between the Chinese newcomers and the native Taiwanese that is not talked about very much, but is a thing. Yeah, here I'm just briefly mentioning the fact that will come up even more in some later slides, that, you know, the number of sinologists, of people who are trained experts in Chinese, was minuscule for most of this period. And it's in 1877 that you're going to have the very first American academic chair set up of Chinese. But it's going to take a long time for the American government to consistently be getting reliable firsthand information about that. We can safely say that missionaries who did report back from China. Oh, I wanted to apologize. The name of the missionary who influenced Hong so much about the Taiping Rebellion, I gave you his middle name. I left out his last name. It's not Issachar Jaycox. It's Issachar Jaycox Roberts is his full name. That Southern Baptist who influenced Hong way back in the mid-19th century. But, you know, missionary reports inevitably are going to have their biases. And I can only imagine what it was like in, let's say, the 20s and 30s to try and get reliable information about China, especially given that, of course, I say China, but as anyone will tell you, it's so far from a monolith. It's made up of so many different groups, has so many different dialects, has so much regional variation, which really came to light in the warlord period, where different provinces were falling under the influence and command of different generals. That generalizing about China as a whole, while a lot of people do it, but more often than not, is a dangerous thing, because it depends on you making assumptions like that what's going on, let's say, in northern China is the same as southern, that what goes on the East Coast can somehow help to explain things going on in the far west of China, and that often can't, or is incredibly different. Even in 2025, and given the speed of transportation and communications. So it's really going to be after the Second World War, that's the last point on this slide, in the 50s and 60s, that you're going to have reliable, consistent, in some cases, native Chinese coming over and getting academic posts at American universities. I mean, one of the earliest ones I know of was in the 1920s at Harvard, where an amazing man, his whole family has a remarkable story. Yuan Ren Chao is given a post at Harvard in, I think, 1921 for the first time. He's going to write a lot of grammars of Chinese with names like Mandarin Primer and so on. His daughter is going to co-write with somebody one of the first extensive discussions of Chinese food and how it can be prepared, and is apparently going to coin the term pot sticker as well as stir fry. So, you know, in some cases, the origins of food words are very obscure. With those particular phrases, as they've come to exist in American English, we can actually trace exactly when they originate and give credit to specific people. Okay, can we go on and note here what I mentioned here, that if you ever see in literature KMT and GMD and you're wondering what's the difference, it's just different transliterations of, you know, what some people, Westerners, will say Kuomintang and some will pronounce as Kuomintang. It's a very small difference, but the acronym is referring to the same so-called nationalist party of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, who flee for Taiwan in 1949. Let's go to the next, Travis, to at least so that we're not a little past the halfway point, maybe. CCP in this period, yes, we're blank, blank. What period am I talking about? Here, I think we are talking, well, what I'm talking about is, let's say, 1940s. How about that? What would be the answer if the period under consideration is 1940 and 1949?
C.
I mean, I would say that I think that D is a more defensible answer myself, just because they are ideologically quite closely aligned, even if geopolitics are preventing them from staying in close contact, but they do exchange diplomatic courtesies, and I would say allied with is a reasonable thing to say. And the point also is, there's a famous Sino-Soviet split that some of you might have read about that takes place in the year 1960 specifically. And so you can't really have a split if what came before was not an alliance. Would you agree? I mean, there has to be some engagement for a split to take place. So I do see why you could say not diplomatically engaged with, but I think there are enough cultural and other kinds of ideological exchanges. You have, in fact, around Mao himself, you have a certain number of Eastern European cum Russian communists, many of whom had been trained in Moscow, who were sent out. Sometimes they take Chinese names, but their real names are, you know, Oscar such and such or Vladimir such and such. And they live for years in Mao's entourage. So I do think that allied with is actually justified, but okay, won't make too much of a deal of it. Let's look at, yeah, I mean, both communist countries, but you do sometimes have communist countries where they're not allied, but yeah. Oh, look, here we come to today. Fantastic. With the whole 19 minutes.
So I do want to share with that today's session, every session, we do traditionally do conclude at 8 at the top of the hour. We also leave 15 extra minutes just for questions or and just an extension of the presentation. We've actually just arrived to today's presentation. So we just, no, it's okay. I mean, it's a lot of, China has a lot of history. And right now we're specifically just speaking primarily about the history that it shares with America that as it relates, you know, to the policy. So there is a lot to share, and it's all useful information. So definitely appreciate it. We will continue for the next 15 minutes. And I'm going to ask, you know, Matthew, now, do you want to do part 3 next week, or do you want to just, you know, get with me on scheduling?
Oh, no, I could, just in order to finish this up, you mean? Yeah, because
okay,
this goes theoretically down to the present day, you know. Yeah. But I'm sure I won't finish it in time. In fact, this would be a good opportunity. I mean, a good time now to ask. By the way, I for some reason when I saw this slide, I thought MA meant, oh, you knew I was from Massachusetts, Travis. But actually, I do have a PhD, believe it or not.
Make sure to update that next time.
But if anyone has questions about this massive material or corrections, because I have no doubt that there are details that I need to be corrected about, please point them out in the chat. Again, I am still not pretending to be a China expert. What I'm presenting myself as is an interested party. And by the way, I just found out this past week that I'm going to get to go and teach in China again, who thinks that it's helpful for U.S. diplomacy. And I'm going to continue to try and improve. But any one of these subtopics on any of these slides, I think, could be built out easily into an hour lecture at least. So.
Can you blog your experience?
Both halves of these, they do have bibliographies and attached, but it's not always easy to, you know, hover the bibliography on the screen for long enough. But yeah, I set them up chronologically, and even going back to, some of the amazing European traveler accounts of the 16th and 17th centuries. But this book is good to look at. This is the book I was referring to by Yuan Ren Chao, right? So this is kind of going back in time a little bit, but it's because I wanted to dwell on the point basically of, you can make the comparison, let us say, of China with, it's not quite as bad with China, but I've learned that in the case of Afghanistan, right, that the very first Western scholarly books about Afghanistan, as opposed to kind of British officers in British India writing sort of observations of the ethnography and so on, but kind of scholarly books about, let's say, Afghan literature, the very earliest ones are around the 1960s. I mean, it was terra incognita until extremely recently, well within the living memory of lots of people walking around today, that people began in the United States to study it seriously. And as some little insider anecdote, I can mention that I talked 25 years ago with someone my father put me in touch with who was in the State Department, and he said that it's disheartening how few people actually in the State Department have firsthand knowledge of and really detailed knowledge of the complexities of Afghan society. In fact, people keep turning to this one scholar, happens to be named Barnett Rubin. I've certainly seen his books around, for a huge amount of, very weighty decisions concerning policy towards Afghanistan. And I can't help but think, I mean, it's a delicate balance, but you probably don't want to rely on any single person, no matter how well informed or wise and whatnot, too much for information about a very large, complicated region. So similarly with China. But I guess what I like about Chao is he's, to a great extent, apolitical. He just wanted to instruct Americans in the fundamentals. He thought that language was kind of at the heart of that. And I think the State Department nowadays sort of basically assumes that, don't they, in their procedures, that language is the reason they spend so much on training people in languages is you cannot even begin to communicate really before you get to a certain point there about language. And I guess you could have an argument about, is it better to have a rather large diplomatic corps of people who have decent passable knowledge of these crucial languages like Chinese, or is it better to rely upon a smaller number but who are deeply immersed, almost fanatical, and who have spent 10 to 15 to 20 years learning Mandarin and other dialects by heart? Because you can't mass produce everything. So, but I don't think the conflict is ever going to have a perfect resolution. I did want to mention, though, this is a super useful Columbia University Press line of books that I mentioned. Sources of Chinese Tradition is really useful, provided you kind of understand what it is and what it's not. It's the product of William Theodore DeBerry, a professor at Columbia, another Columbia professor like Hofstadter, and some associates around him. From the 50s is when the series began. And there's a sources of Japanese tradition, of Indian tradition, Korean, etc. But they really assume that to get at Chinese society, you need to first learn about its religious and philosophical underpinnings. So there's a lot of Taoist texts reproduced, kind of abridged, certainly just extracts from them. A lot of Confucian texts, of course, since Confucian texts were at the heart of the Chinese education system right up until the end of the 19th century. They start to do away with it just as the Qing Empire is getting close to ending in the very early 20th century. And so spiritual and religious teachings, similarly, if you go to sources of Indian tradition, there's a lot from the Mahabharata, from the Vedas and other religious texts. So if you're looking for more secular fare, if you're looking for even Maoist stuff, I think maybe at the very end of that book, they might have some really brief stuff, but they tend to give a heavy weight to religious and philosophical. And I've been reading some academic articles that are saying that in the early days, adherents and disciples of Confucius, by the way, were not known by any word that actually includes, for example, his name, Kongshu, but rather, or Kongfushu, but rather were called the Ru, simply. There's a lot in classical Chinese that is monosyllabic, so that it would be a very simple word is not surprising, but it was very interesting, and the number of rabbit holes one could go down can seem overwhelming. But I do want to say that I'm very happy to send the bibliographies, such as they are at the moment, to anyone, and I continue to expand them to make them into more usable tools. But just, you can always get in touch with me through Travis, and he can give you my contact information if you want me to email them to you.
Are they the
Yeah.
same ones as in the presentation that you have?
Yes. If you included
Okay.
those slides, then sure. Then I guess that'll be available. Yeah.
Which they're going to be at the end of this. And there's another slide that I'll add to it with the newest. So this may be what he is speaking to. So I'll make sure to share this.
It is indeed. Yes. And novels, you see, I mentioned Pearl Buck, great novel called The Good Earth. This is one area where Westerners and Chinese agreed that novel, she was from West Virginia, but again, belonged to a missionary family. That novel's from, so far as I remember, either the 20s or early 30s. But it's about peasant life. They, just like the most famous 20th century Chinese sociologist, Feng, I believe his last name is Zhao Tao. He is obsessed with the peasantry. He gives a lot of attention to the way rural societies work. I mean, so this is an area where everyone seems to agree, is that you have to understand rural Chinese society and the rhythms of rural life. To some extent, also the crucial importance of rivers, as in other ancient societies like Egypt, for Chinese existence. And that's related, of course, to the population that depends on rivers for their very existence. And then a lot of scholars, including the American scholar Owen Lattimore, is going to come up a little later, present Chinese society as constant conflicts between nomadic and sedentary civilizations, which is interesting because those of you who studied sociology might remember the most famous so-called founder of sociology, the North African Ibn Khaldun, whose idea of the conflict between the desert and the zone, so-called, is so fundamental to his work known as the Muqaddimah, which is considered, one of the first studies of what it is, what are the main tensions that are inherent in human civilization, and one of them being nomadic societies butting up against settled societies. And that has happened so many times in Chinese history, for example, such as the Mongols, the example of which I gave, where Genghis Khan is leading nomadic forces where basically almost 100% of the military age manpower can move around and fight, whereas they're going up against settled societies where the peasants cannot afford to leave their lands for too long, especially at harvest time, lest they starve to death, so that the empires they're going against, the settled civilizations, are more limited in the manpower they can actually summon at any one time. Same thing is an explicable tool for Russian civilization, where Mongols, Pechenegs, and Cumans, and Polovtsi, and many, many other peoples come out of the steppes, the Eurasian steppes, and butt up against settled Rus and other sort of, in what's now Russia, civilization. But okay, let's not get off track. Can we maybe go back to the point where we were, or do you want to wrap things up, Travis?
Yeah, I actually think this may be a really great place for us to put a bookmark in where we were. So essentially, we'll be starting from the beginning. So I'll just change this date to next week. And if there's any other conflicts with your schedule, just let me know. But we will pick this up, from the beginning slides here. I'm so grateful. Let's give Matthew a round of applause for sharing not only his passion and experience, but definitely his expertise here in this subject. I know I'm learning a lot just through making the slides for him, and I can't wait to share those with you. So if you have any feedback from tonight's session, definitely feel free to email me at travis@thefsot.com, and I will get with you and receive that. Any constructive or any compliments, I'll share them with the facilitators that we've had next week. And also, I don't think I actually said it, but if you're actually interested in leading a session as well, definitely let me know, and we can coordinate based on availability and timing. So next week, we'll look at part 3, U.S. policy towards China, and all that we have dug into. The week after, we will dive into the English expression. So we're going to start with grammar and syntax, sentence structure, and editing and proofreading. I found that this is one of the top choices that you, the future diplomats, made in the form that let me know exactly what you may need support with as it relates to English expression. So we will continue to comb through each of the sessions, each of the three FSOT sections. But Matthew, you were not here when we decided this, but there's a lot of people who want to have a bonus session on Wednesday. So I'm going to see if I can invite everyone who has taken the FSOT Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, and Tuesday and Wednesday, and share their experience on Wednesday evening for anyone who wants to join. I'll make sure to share the invite in the chat, so and via email as well. But if you are interested in some of the resources that was shared by some of our speakers earlier with the FSOT.com, which is the group that we have created and built together through your feedback, definitely scan this QR code and you'll get a 60-day trial, or you can just go directly to the FSOT.com, or if you would like to just email me with your name and 60-day trial, I'll make sure to get you that 60-day trial so you can get access to the flashcards. You can get access to the private replays that are up there, including the practice tests, which include the logical and reasoning. If you want that experience that gives you the ability to flag the questions and also come back to them and have that timed experience, which is more suitable to the actual FSOT versus what's on the state website, you can have 60 days to give this a try. So if you're taking the test this week and you just want to practice your time, and you can do that as well. And I'm grateful as well for the feedback that in the confirmation that the logic and reasoning that we've been doing it through the pop quiz, mind you, we've gone through 150 questions so far. Great job to all of you through the pop quiz that we've had in the WhatsApp chat, and also through the FSOA style logic and reasoning sessions that we've had. We've gone through a total of 150 questions. So I have more, so we'll keep plugging away, but we will have variety in our pop quiz. But what I've been told today is that if you have taken the test, that they saw similarity and symmetry between the types of questions, including the difficulty of the questions that you've already been taking with the logic and reasoning on the FSOT, on the actual FSOT. So let's keep that challenge going. Let's keep the motivation going. Let's keep the energy going in the chat too. So I see Kevin says he took it on Saturday. Hope to share. Please do. I'll share in the chat as far as the invitation. If anyone has any questions, I'm here to stay for a couple minutes. Other than that, I hope everyone has a great evening. If you are taking the test in the morning, you've got this. I look forward to hearing your results. Everyone have a great night. Thank you.